Good afternoon, everyone. Now it's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Reiter, Professor Russ, as he prefer. It's much more than a pleasure and an honor. It's a privilege to us to learn about his lecture. Professor Reiter has dedicated a long part of his life on the studies of melatonin, including in animal cells and vegetable cells. And in fact, it's a unique opportunity to stay with him in Botucatu. It's a great, I really appreciate his coming and his collaborating and his friendship. Thank you, Professor Russell, to come. Now, I will introduce Professor Russ to you. He is a professor of cell biology in the Department of Cell Systems and Anatomy at UT Health, San Antonio, Texas, United States. Professor Russ has received 3 honorary MD degrees and 1 honorary Doctor of Science degree from international universities. His research relates to the multiple receptor-independent and receptor-dependent actions of melatonin in humans, animals, and plants. He has trained 25 PhD students and 144 postdoctoral fellows. Professor has received numerous awards for his research and has published numerous research papers, reviews, and chapters, and he has written or edited about 25 books. Based on Google Scholar, his papers have been cited in the scientific literature more than 134,000 times. Oh my gosh. And his age index is 178. Thomson Reuters lists Dr. Reiter as a highly cited scientist, top 1%, and listed him as one of the world's most influential scientific minds in 2014. He's been also an invited speaker at more than 300 international meetings and symposia, and he is currently the co-editor of the Melatonin Research, a new periodical, and he is the founder and the past editor of the Journal of Pineal Research. And I'm pleased to be associated to Dr. Professor Russ, and it's a great pleasure to receive in our institute, and feel free in yourself home and to make your talk. And now, and after Professor Russell talk, we will open for debates, discussions, and questions. Okay? Please, Professor.
Thank you very much. I don't mean any disrespect by calling my colleague Chuffa. It's Professor Chuffa, but he's become a good friend, and I'm pleased to have him known as Chuffa. I work on melatonina, but I unfortunately know no Portuguese. Maybe 2 words. So I will speak in English, and I will try to speak slowly. But anytime you want to stop me and tell me I'm speaking too quickly or you don't understand anything, you are welcome to interrupt me. I currently live in Texas, but Texas weather is very similar to southern Brazil. Hot in the summer and comfortable in the winter. But I was actually born in Minnesota, near Canada. And there, of course, it is very cold in the winter. This is California, that's New York, and Texas is this important state in the middle. And San Antonio is right about here, in the bottom third of the state. Melatonina, a very interesting and multifunctional molecule. I'm going to convince you that it's a very old molecule, even older than me, if you can imagine. Very old molecule. It exists in every species that is currently living or ever existed, we think. It's hard to measure melatonin in extinct species, but the data suggests this is the case. The structure, melatonin is found in bacteria and every organism between bacteria and human, and the structure of melatonin is identical. Your melatonin is just like a bacterial melatonin. And it's non-toxic. Of course, it's endogenously produced, so it certainly doesn't kill you, but it's available as a supplement, and it has no known toxicity at this point. This is kind of a summary of some of the things melatonin does. I mentioned it's a very old molecule, and it's learned during evolution to do a lot of different things. And it does those things very well. For example, it's involved in circadian rhythms. Melatonin itself in the blood exhibits a circadian rhythm. I'm not going to talk about its effect on the heart. In Sao Paulo, we'll talk a great deal about the effects on the heart and on cancer. Melatonin is a very strong anti-cancer agent. It influences the immune system, metabolism, gastrointestinal tract, and especially the brain. The brain doesn't happen to be on here, but melatonin has many important. These are the cellular actions. It controls all these events. But I'm going to specifically talk about its association with mitochondrial physiology. Melatonin in the pineal gland, which is near the center of your brain, is regulated by the light-dark environment. And it's light perceived by the eyes, not through the skin. It could be the skin. Vitamin D3 is synthesized in the skin under sunlight, but that has no effect on the pineal gland. It's what your eyes see in terms of light and darkness that is important in cueing the pineal to produce melatonin. Especially light inhibits, suppresses melatonin production. So right now, because we are in light, all of you have low blood levels of melatonin. At night, they will increase, and I will show you what your nighttime levels look like. But it's especially blue wavelengths of light. Not all light, only blue wavelengths. But all these white lights have blue wavelengths. So if you are in white light, it's the blue light that is inhibiting your melatonin production. That becomes very important because this afternoon, when it gets dark outside, there's not a person in this room that will be in darkness. You will turn on a light, and that will prevent you from producing melatonin in your pineal gland. And that is very important over the course of a lifetime. The interesting thing about the detection by the eyes, it's not the rods and cones. Rods and cones are for vision. You are seeing me, I'm seeing you because of the rods and cones. Unrelated to the effects of light on the pineal gland. It has a small number of ganglion cells, only 1% to 2% of the ganglion cells, and there's not many ganglion cells to begin with. Contain a special photopigment called melanopsin. That's only in these cells, and they are the cells that respond to these wavelengths to suppress melatonin. I will illustrate that, and here's the blue wavelengths of light that are important. This is white light, all the wavelengths of white light, but it's only this light that is suppressive. The eyes are connected to the clock, the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus. Your clock exhibits a circadian rhythm, but it's synchronized by the light-dark cycle. You have to realize that during evolution, the only light to which we were exposed is the rising and the setting of the sun. And it's 24 hours between these individual curves. And that's what synchronizes your clock. Your clock is not very accurate. The rhythm of the clock is about 25 hours, not 24. So it's essential that you have this light impulse to regulate it to 24 hours. The problem is, we now have artificial light. On the weekends, some of you may stay up until 4 in the morning in light. Evolutionarily, you were supposed to be in dark. And this is very important for your health, for diseases, and for your well-being. The information in the clock is directed to the upper thoracic cord, preganglionic sympathetic fibers to the superior cervical ganglion, and then they end in the pineal gland. And neural pathway must be intact. In other words, if you have transection of your cervical cord or brainstem, you have no melatonin rhythm because the pineal gland cannot respond to light and darkness. It needs, absolutely needs, its sympathetic innervation. At night, these nerve endings represented here release norepinephrine and cause the production of melatonin. Every night, but you must be in darkness. You produce melatonin. Melatonin, once produced, is immediately released. In the anterior pituitary, you have many hormones that are stored. Growth hormone, large amounts, not in the pineal. When melatonin is produced, it is immediately released into the blood, and as a consequence, every night, you have a rise in melatonin. Hopefully every night you have a rise in melatonin. But I'm going to convince you that only 5% of the melatonin in your entire body comes from the pineal gland. I'm going to show you where else melatonin is produced. But your blood levels of melatonin, are exclusively from your pineal gland. This is Aaron Lerner. He's the individual who discovered melatonin in 1958. A good personal friend of mine. He died in 2007, but he's a dermatologist who discovered melatonin, and he had to extract 250,000 bovine cow pineals to get a little bit of white melatonin that he used to identify melatonin. 1958. By the early 1960s, I was already working on melatonin. Here's the pineal gland. This is the mid-sagittal section of your brain. Well, not your brain, somebody's brain. And here's the pineal gland, and it's innervated, and it's connected to the eyes, as I showed you. Every night, during darkness, you should have a nighttime rise in melatonin. Everything suggests the higher the melatonin, the better. Unfortunately, there are some of you genetically predisposed to only have this melatonin rhythm. It would be very important to know that. If you have this melatonin rhythm compared to this one, if you knew that, that's very important in terms of your ultimate health, so far as we can tell. The problem is, if you want to have your melatonin levels measured and you go to your doctor and you say, I want to measure my melatonin levels, he said, it's daytime. During the day, I can tell you it's going to be low. What you want to know is how high your peak is at night, but has to be collected in the dark. Very difficult to keep blood samples in your dark, and your doctor does not work at night, and if he doesn't work at night, he doesn't work in the dark. So in fact, it's very difficult. It's easy to measure melatonin. It's difficult to find out what your nighttime peak is. These were done in my laboratory where we had people sitting in the dark and we drew blood samples. I mentioned melatonin was an ancient molecule. We don't know precisely when it was evolved, but sometime between 3.5 and 2.5 billion, not million, billion years ago, 350,000 million years ago, melatonin may have evolved in prokaryotic bacteria. It evolved in prokaryotes. We know it exists in bacteria, in alpha proteobacteria and in cyanobacteria. Bacteria produce melatonin, and the melatonin they produce is the very same molecule that you produce. Well, during evolution, what happened is eventually eukaryotes appeared, and they ate prokaryotes as food, digested them for nutrients. Well, eventually they said, maybe we shouldn't digest them, we should evolve them into something that can help it. We know now that the bacteria are the precursors of mitochondria and also the precursors of chloroplasts in plants from aerobic and photosynthetic bacteria respectively. So you say, well, it evolved from bacteria, the chloroplasts and the mitochondria. Did they return the ability to produce melatonin? The evidence now is that they did preserve the ability to produce melatonin in your mitochondria, and if you are a plant, I don't see any plants here, if you are a plant, also in your chloroplasts. In fact, every species that have been tested currently, insects, algae, cats, dogs, camels, humans, every species that have been tested produces melatonin. But of course, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of species that have not been tested. But given that melatonin is produced in mitochondria and chloroplasts, we believe every species has mitochondria and or chloroplasts. So we think every species that currently exists or has ever existed, all the extinct animals, we believe, produce melatonin because it evolved here 350,000 million years ago. A very, very old molecule. Then as organisms evolved, they retained the ability. We know unicells produce melatonin. Sharks produce melatonin. We presume the dinosaurs produced melatonin. They had better mitochondria, so we presume, and of course, you produce it as well. But this melatonin is produced in every cell. Remember, in the pineal gland, that's only a very small percentage of the total melatonin you produce, but it's the only gland that releases it in the blood. Every cell in your body produces melatonin, but it doesn't get into the blood. Only the pineal gland for this circadian production of melatonin. In plants, melatonin is very, very important. Melatonin was discovered in plants in 1995 by our laboratory. We're animal biologists, but we happened to discover melatonin in plants. We now know that Melatonin, of course, functions as an antioxidant in both plants and animals. It's a very good protector against free radicals. It impacts growth and rhythms and stress responses in plants. If you are a plant, you are growing here, and it gets too hot that it may kill you, what a plant does immediately is upregulate its melatonin, protect it from heat. If it gets too dry, the plant upregulates its melatonin. If it rains too much, the plant upregulates. Any stress, biotic or abiotic, even biotic stressors, infections in plants, they immediately upregulate their melatonin as a defense again. We think melatonin may also be upregulated in animals, but we're not sure. The problem with plants is they cannot move. If it gets too hot, they are here and there's nothing they can do. Animals can move out of the sun or away from the drought, but plants have to stay there. They do not move, so they use melatonin to protect them. We know they protect plants from all kinds of stress, and also animals. You are protected strongly by your melatonin. In the humans and all animals, melatonin influences immunity, sleep. Most of you know that melatonin is related to sleep. A relatively insignificant function of melatonin as far as I'm concerned, but nevertheless that's important, has strong anti-cancer effects and other. How is it that eukaryotes became available, or how did they develop the capability of producing melatonin? I remind you that prokaryotes, bacteria, produce melatonin. Here's a eukaryote. It was engulfing, it was eating these and digesting them for nutrients. Eventually, they said, there's some advantage of keeping these because they produce melatonin, and melatonin is good to have. So what they did is they evolved these bacteria into mitochondria that became plant cells. This is called the endosymbiotic theory for the origin of mitochondria and chlorine. This theory is accepted as the origin of mitochondria. Also, in terms of cyanobacteria, which are photosynthetic, some cells ingested them and they became plants, and they have both mitochondria and chloroplasts. In general, plants have higher levels of melatonin because they have two sources. They have mitochondrial melatonin, and they have, of course, from the chloroplast. And this, she did not invent or initially describe, but she advanced the theory, endosymbiotic theory, for the origin of mitochondria and chloroplasts. Remember, these organelles are from bacteria that were already producing melatonin, and we think that this was preserved in every mitochondrion in your body. And your mitochondria exist in every cell except your red blood cells. The red blood cells don't survive very long, but every other cell in your body has mitochondria, and every one of them, so far as we know, is producing melatonin. And I'll show you why they produce melatonin. This illustrates the widespread distribution of, here's melatonin, a very simple molecule, N-acetyl, 5-methoxytryptamine. Very small molecule that interacts with many, many other molecules. That's the first time I have ever been able to shut off the electricity. You people must really dislike my lecture. Say, go shut off the electricity. He'll take a little while to get, but at any rate, I remind you, in your brain alone, you have trillions of cells, tens of trillions of mitochondria, and every one of them is producing melatonin. We will get into more of that in a little while, and I'll show you the significance of that. You also have to remember that the density of mitochondria in cells varies greatly according to the cell. Your heart needs a lot of energy, a lot of ATP. So your heart has more mitochondria per cell than most other organs. Your brain also has a lot of mitochondria, but especially your heart. Some cells they all have mitochondria, but not as many as in the heart, because it's proportional to the energy requirement. But also, it also dictates how much melatonin is produced in these individual organs. Because of melatonin's long evolution, have to remember it exists in every cell during evolution, and it's learned to cooperate with a lot of other cells. Many of melatonin's actions may well involve other molecules in the cell, many of which we do not yet understand. We are getting closer to understanding what melatonin does, but its effects are pervasive. If you will test melatonin in a situation where you work, in your experimental situation, if you measure the right endpoint, I can assure you that melatonin will have an effect. There are very few events, molecular events that occur within cells that are not somehow directly or indirectly impacted by melatonin. I remind you that during the day, your blood levels of melatonin are very low, but your mitochondria still have very high levels. The reason the pineal gland releases melatonin into the blood is to provide information about time of day. Every cell in your body, 10 to 15% of the genes are dedicated to circadian rhythms. In every nucleus of your body, 10 to 15% of the genes are concerned with circadian rhythms. How does your liver know when it is dark? It changes its function over 24 hours, but how does your liver know it is dark? It reads the melatonin message. If melatonin is high, the liver says it has to be dark, because the pineal gland only produces melatonin at night and releases it. Now herein, we're on. Yes. I just wanted to say, and that's the danger of turning on a light at night. If you turn on a light at night, even for 1 second, your melatonin level, your eyes and your brain are not stupid. They saw that light. And they say, oh, it's daytime. Over evolution, light means day. No exceptions. Light only occurs during the day, and they shut down melatonin. And now your liver's sitting there, and they say, what's going on now? I know, it's supposed to be night, and all of a sudden it's day. This is what confuses your circadian rhythms. Physiologically and pathologically, there's a very big price you pay for misuse of light. Misuse of light is becoming a very important factor that influences human health. Unfortunately, if you live here, if you live in Rio, if you live in Recife, if you live in Caracas, you look at outer space of the earth, nothing but light. Darkness is disappearing. And that has a very significant impact on our circadian rhythms because of interrupting with melatonin. And as I say, there is a price to pay, especially in terms of neurodegenerative diseases and cancer. I'm going to talk about that in St. Paulo, not here. But at any rate, avoid light at night. Once you go to bed and turn out that light, do not turn that light on until you awaken in the morning. Because 1 second, you go to bed tonight and at 12 o'clock you turn on your light and you say, oh, Russ said I shouldn't do it. Too late. Your brain is smart. It says that's light, that equals day. Shut down melatonin. So, sleep in the dark and avoid light at night. But at any rate, in reference to plants and animals, here's melatonin, N-acetyl, 5-methoxytryptamine. No matter what plant that has been measured, algae, macroalgae, microalgae, ferns, every species where melatonin has been measured, it's present. And every animal, unicells, insects contain melatonin. The worms are crawling around on the ground outside. They contain melatonin. Fish, of course, birds, mammals, and you. And of course, it's produced in mitochondria of all cells, represented here in these organs, but chloroplasts also produce it, and plants have both chloroplasts and mitochondria, so we generally think they have higher levels of melatonin. But they need higher levels of melatonin. They cannot move. They have to tolerate what's given to them. We can move, we can do things to behaviorally overcome stress. Plants cannot. So they need more melatonin to protect them. Now we're going to talk about mitochondria. Mitochondria are wonderful organelles, really very special. But remember, they're from bacteria. But they also undergo oxidative phosphorylation for the production of ATP, your energy. All the energy is needed for everything. Every process in your cell, synthetic or catabolic, requires energy, and that's generated generally in the mitochondria. And during that process, there's a series of proteins where electrons are shunted between these proteins to eventually culminate in ATP production. Well, the system is not perfect. Sometimes these electrons, when they're going across barrier, they dropped. And there's oxygen nearby, and it molecularly reduces oxygen to free radicals. Free radicals are consequential in many, many, many diseases. Free radicals are generally considered toxic, which is a little bit unfair because there are some beneficial free radicals too. But generally, free radicals are toxic. The primary theory of aging, the primary theory for which you use is you are producing too many free radicals. And that causes loss of brain cells, induces cancer, causes deterioration of your liver, weakness, eyesight problems, crow's feet in the skin, all relate to free radicals. It's a primary theory of aging. Not the exclusive, but nevertheless, free radicals that are produced primarily, not exclusively, but primarily in the mitochondria, cause you to age and contribute to many diseases. So you want to neutralize those as much as possible. In 1993, we discovered that melatonin was a free radical scavenger, an antioxidant. Here's oxygen. And I put a note here. You can't live without it. If you're not breathing, you're dead. But it's very difficult to live with it. It's difficult to live with it Because it creates these free radicals. Free radicals have an unpaired electron. These dots are all electrons, and that's an unpaired electron. That makes this molecule very reactive. If I'm a free radical, superoxide anion, I will steal one of his electrons, and now he's damaged. Just look at him. In other words, it becomes a chain reaction. Then he steals an electron from him, and this can go on indefinitely. And of course, they're very reactive. And of course, the worst is the hydroxyl radical. This one is so reactive that when it is produced, it only damages this portion of the cell right next to it. It damages a neighboring molecule. It doesn't go looking around. In other words, if I'm a free radical, you people in the back of the room would not have to worry. It's only you people right here in the front. I'm so reactive that I'm produced and immediately damage. They don't move anywhere. This is the most reactive, toxic. The peroxynitride anion is very toxic also. It's not a free radical. You see, there's no unpaired electrons, but it's a strong oxidizing agent. And the ones with an asterisk by are all those that have been shown to be incapacitated, scavenged by melatonin. Melatonin is a very good protector. Now remember, I told you that a lot of free radicals are produced in your mitochondria. And who is in your mitochondria to protect you? Good old melatonin. We think that's why melatonin evolved in mitochondria. If you didn't have mitochondria in your, if you didn't have melatonin in your mitochondria, you would suffer greatly, very rapidly. Your mitochondria would be destroyed, so far as we can tell. So free radicals produced primarily in mitochondria, not exclusively, but fortunately melatonin is there to detoxify, to neutralize these factors. But melatonin is even better than that. Here again is melatonin. Other antioxidants include vitamin C, vitamin E. A lot of people take that as antioxidant to protect against free radicals. Vitamin C scavenges one radical. Vitamin E scavenges one radical. Then they have to be recycled. Melatonin works totally differently. Melatonin donates an electron to detoxify a free radical and then becomes cyclic 3-hydroxymelatonin. In other words, it becomes a different molecule, and cyclic 3-hydroxymelatonin is also a free radical scavenger. And when it scavenges, it becomes N-acetyl N-form of 5-methoxykynuramine. It is also a free radical scavenger, and when it produces N-acetyl 5-methoxykynuramine, and it also is a scavenger. In other words, the parent, the child, the grandchild, the great-grandchild, and the great-great-grandchild are all scavengers. We have calculated, we haven't proven, but we have calculated that melatonin may in fact scavenge 10 free radicals. Vitamin E, 1. Vitamin C, 1. The pharmaceutical company has been very interested in this research because protecting mitochondria is everything. Your cell really depends on your mitochondria because all the energy for everything that is done in the cell requires ATP. Fortunately, melatonin is there. And unfortunately, as you age, you lose it. And that's where the effect of melatonin aging comes into being. As you age, your melatonin production wanes. The older you are, the faster you age. When you are young, you don't age very quickly. As you become old, you age faster. You're losing your best protection. You're losing your melatonin. In all of us, not in all of us, There's evidence now that if you take a sample of 65-year-old people, some of which look like they're 80, and some of them look like they're 45, those in good health have a better preserved melatonin rhythm. Those in poor health have virtually no melatonin. That doesn't prove anything. That's a correlation. That means some people preserve, but the implication is, from many studies, that the more melatonin you have, the better the melatonin. So the higher melatonin peak you have every night, the better. If you are deficient in melatonin, so far as we can tell, that is not good. Now, free radicals are produced in mitochondria. If you eat melatonin, and many people use melatonin as a supplement in the United States, including me, for 27 years, because I want to protect my mitochondria from free radical damage. If I take melatonin to get into the mitochondria to neutralize those free radicals. This is a study done with Mi Jai Zhu. She's a collaborator in Taipei, Taiwan. We looked at cells. These are astrocytes from the brain, and they are stained for mitochondria. All those blue dots are mitochondria. If you incubate them with the precursor of the hydroxyl radical, hydrogen peroxide, you can see that the mitochondria get very hot. They are producing a lot of free radicals. These cells will die, absolutely dead by apoptosis in 3 hours. If you add hydrogen peroxide with melatonin, that doesn't happen. Melatonin goes into the mitochondria, neutralizes those free radicals, and protects your cells. So if you take melatonin orally, it is good for your mitochondria. In addition to the mitochondria, the melatonin your mitochondria is producing. Melatonin is primarily taken as a sleep aid. Most people know it as beneficial for sleep, but I think its other effects are far superior to what it does for sleep. Within the last 3 years, the evidence has become progressively stronger that melatonin gets into the mitochondria. Even the means by which melatonin gets in there have been identified. This is a study by Ho in China. What he showed, in the mitochondrial membrane, there are specific transporters, oligopeptide transporters called PEP1 and PEP2, that exist and transport melatonin into the mitochondria against a gradient. There's a higher concentration of melatonin in the mitochondria than the cytosol. Achieved without, it's actively transported through these PEP1 and PEP2 transporters. He only measured this, unfortunately, in cancer cells. The question is, do normal cells also possess those receptors? We think so, but of course it hasn't been proven. But in cancer cells, melatonin gets in there very well, and we think that the anti-cancer actions of melatonin relate to its ability to get into mitochondria. We have measured melatonin mitochondria over a 24-hour period, very high in mitochondria. In the liver and the brain, we measured it. For example, it's 10 times higher in the mitochondria than it is in the cytosol. Very important. Mitochondria is where the action is in terms of free radicals. So an active uptake system would be very advantageous. This is an amazing study. Amazing study because of when it was done. In 1973, a gentleman by the name of Karenyi in Eastern Europe looked at cells and immunocytochemically identified this enzyme, AANAT. It is rate limiting in melatonin production. 2 enzymes are involved. Serotonin is converted to N-acetyl serotonin by N-acetyl transferase. That's O-methylated by acetyl serotonin methyltransferase. He measured this stain represents this enzyme, and this enzyme determines how much melatonin is produced. So already in 1975, he published this paper. Nobody believed him. Nobody believed him. They said, no, mitochondria cannot be the source of melatonin. That data lingered in the literature until about 3 years ago. And all of a sudden, everybody becomes interested in mitochondrial melatonin production. But he did it already in 1975, and now there are many studies that have confirmed that. The first of which I'm going to show is also by a friend of mine, Goshi Lu. This is his graduate student, he's in Beijing. What he did is something very interesting. I'll tell you why it's interesting. He looked at oocyte, the female egg mitochondria for the production of melatonin. We know that melatonin is very good if you want to get pregnant. And if you want a successful pregnancy, melatonin is very good because it prevents damage to the oocyte, free radicals. He did electron microscopy also of this enzyme. You can hardly see the mitochondria here, but he concluded that AANAT and melatonin production occur in mitochondria, exactly like Karenia had said. But his study is different. He isolated the mitochondria, incubated them without serotonin, without precursor, no melatonin is formed. If you incubate them with serotonin, then a lot of melatonin is formed. So in fact, this pathway is very active in mitochondria of oocytes. Think about this. Where do all your mitochondria come from? Not from your father. All of your mitochondria are from your mother, and your oocytes produce melatonin. These mitochondria develop into the mitochondria in every one of your cells. It's very likely that the ability to produce and retain melatonin exists in every one of your cells because the egg from which you came, the mitochondria produce melatonin. And everything now suggests that mitochondria produce melatonin. Another work. It'll appear to be a very complicated slide, but I'll explain it. It's not complicated at all. Again, we're talking about serotonin, N-acetyl serotonin, melatonin, and these two enzymes. This one determines the amount of melatonin formed. Several people have shown it exists in mitochondria. And that's what this study shows too. If you look at the protein for these two enzymes, they are clearly in mitochondria of the brain, as well as the chaperone 1433 zeta. That's in there as well. So your brain mitochondria contain the protein at least for the enzymes that form melatonin. If you digest the outer two membranes around mitochondria, if you digest the outer membrane, these proteins still exist, indicating that they are in the matrix of the mitochondria. If you measure it throughout a 24-hour period, there's no rhythm in melatonin production in mitochondria. We published evidence 4 years ago showing that to be the case. Only your pineal gland produces melatonin rhythmically. Every one of your cells produces it uniformly throughout a 24-hour period. The other important thing, well, they did a lot of important things. I'm not going to reveal them all. But this one, they took deuterated serotonin, exactly like Goshi Lu had done, incubated them with these cells, and they produce melatonin. So your brain cells also produce melatonin. That's been shown now for many different cells. It's very likely that every mitochondrion in your body and every other species that currently exists or ever existed produce melatonin during their lifetime. I put this in for a very specific reason, because it's by a Portuguese colleague of mine, Quintana in Portugal. She looked at AANAT in choroid plexus cells. She stained them for, these are mitochondria, MIT mitochondria in green, AANAT in red, and when she merged them, all of the AANAT is in mitochondria. And there's a lot of mitochondria. Every one of them. Every one of them. Producing melatonin. You can see that here, there's no AANAT, there's no mitochondria, and there's no NAT. AANAT is undoubtedly associated with mitochondria, and mitochondria form melatonin. And that's my colleague from Portugal. What this means is you have actually two sources of melatonin. You have the pineal gland, regulated by that is released on a nightly basis, and is important for circadian rhythms. This tells every cell in your body. How does your big toe know when it's dark? It changes its function. The muscle changes their function. How do they know? They read the melatonin message. But if you turn on the lights, then every cell says, what is going on? That was a very short night, but it has to be day, because during evolution, light always meant day. There were no artificial light sources. Over our last 4 million years of evolution, this system has learned that darkness is night, light is day, and it occurs on 24-hour rhythm. But now, with artificial light, we've totally destroyed that. You probably got up the morning when it was dark. What did you do? Turn on a light. We were never meant to have light at night. So you have an alternate source of melatonin. Every cell in the mitochondria produces melatonin. Totally different than this. This melatonin is never released into the blood. It only acts in the cell as an antioxidant. I'm not going to discuss all the actions of melatonin in the cell. It has actions on receptors on the mitochondria itself. It has genomic actions, and it has actions on adjacent cells, but it never gets into the blood. If you surgically remove the pineal gland in any animals, blood levels are low. If you look at the mitochondria, they're still producing melatonin. But it doesn't. So you have two pools. A minor pool, 95% of the melatonin you produce is not from your pineal gland. It's from all your other cells. Now, so what? Who cares? Why is it relevant? Very relevant. Especially in cancer. I'm going to talk a little bit about cancer now. Melatonin has strong anti-cancer effects. This is a normal mitochondria. Normally, glucose is from the blood, converted to pyruvate, and pyruvate is shunted into the mitochondria for the production of acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA is very important for the function of mitochondria. Feeds the citric acid cycle, which aids in oxidative phosphorylation, improves ATP production. What wasn't realized until we suggested it 5 months ago, acetyl-CoA is a necessary cofactor for NAT. NAT will not convert serotonin to N-acetylserotonin unless acetyl-CoA is there. And acetyl-CoA is a primary metabolite of pyruvate in the mitochondria. Very, very important. So under normal conditions, your mitochondria have the capability of producing melatonin because they have acetyl-CoA in their mitochondria. Very helpful. But something very bad happens when you have cancer. If I could have the next slide, please. This is a slide from a former postdoc of mine, David Blask. They did some very interesting studies that they could not explain. They kept animals in a light-dark cycle of light, dark, or in a cycle where it was light, dark, but it was contaminated with light, as if you're living in a city. And light and dark, but low levels of melatonin because they were in light at night. They looked at the metabolism of mammary gland tumors, human mammary gland tumors growing in these animals. And what they found was something very interesting. During the day, they, in fact, are very cancer-type cells. But at night, they are normal cells. The implication is that cancer cells are only cancer cells half of the time. The other time, solid tumors are only cancerous during the day. This has never been seen because cancer biologists never look at cancers at night. And if you do in vitro studies, you will never see this effect. It appears that solid cancers, and there are a lot of those, are only of the cancer phenotype during the day. At night, they are normal cells. Why? Why? If you put them in a light-dark cycle where they have light at night, so the melatonin levels are low, look what happens. The red line, they are cancerous 24 hours a day. So when you expose yourself to light at night, if you have a solid tumor, they are probably cancerous all the time. But cancer cells seem to be normal cell phenotype at night because melatonin is high. Melatonin causes them to switch between cancer and normal. Melatonin in the mitochondria, and I'll show how that occurs. This is the growth of these tumors, red, and this is the growth of the tumors with a light-dark cycle. And this is the melatonin rhythm. In this with dark or high, in this with light or low. And they don't switch. They are cancerous all the time. That's why cancers grow faster when you contaminate the darkness with light. But it gets worse. If you can imagine, it gets worse. Next slide, please. That is represented here. This, the use of the impact of pyruvate on acetyl-CoA does not occur in cancer cells, and it's called the Warburg effect. What happens in normal cells, glucose is taken up, converted to pyruvate, gets into the cell, into the mitochondria, produces acetyl-CoA, and carbon dioxide is released into the blood. Cancer cells uptake glucose, they metabolize the pyruvate, but pyruvate cannot get in to the mitochondria. And I'll explain why. And as a consequence, it's converted to lactic acid that's released into the blood. And lactic acid in the microenvironment of the cancer cell makes it very acidic. Acidic microenvironment to cancer cells is an advantage. They proliferate faster, they metastasize faster, they do a lot of things faster. So you do not want this Marburg effect to occur. And I showed you the blast experiment, they only do that during the day, not at night, because they have melatonin. I think that's explained in the next slide. Yes. Now we're talking about a cancer cell. Here's a blood vessel. Glucose is taken up by cancer cells and normal cells. It's converted to pyruvate, and in normal cells it goes in to the mitochondria and converted to acetyl-CoA. But this does not occur in cancer cells. And I'll tell you why it doesn't occur. What cancer cells do, they convert it by lactic acid dehydrogenase to lactate, and that's released. This is the Warburg effect. You do not want the Warburg effect. You want to overcome that. In cancer cells, the reason pyruvate is not going in is because cancer inhibits this enzyme, pyruvate dehydrogenase kinase, which inhibits this rate-limiting enzyme in the conversion of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. The point is that cancer cells are not producing acetyl coenzyme A. This is absolutely critical. Acetyl coenzyme A is required for melatonin. That means your cancer cells also are not producing melatonin, and melatonin is a strong anti-cancer agent. This may have many, many implications. If you do not have acetyl-CoA in your mitochondria, which cancer cells do without, then you also do not produce melatonin. Not the ideal situation. Not even near a good situation. A very bad situation. So, cell mitochondria cannot produce melatonin because they lack acetyl-CoA. They don't convert pyruvate to acetyl-CoA. Pyruvate, in fact, is converted to lactic acid in the cytosol. And there's advantages to the cancer cell to produce this in the cytosol. I won't go into that, but it gives cancer cells an advantage. They produce a lot of precursors required for melatonin synthesis, for DNA production, because of this. You want your pyruvate in your mitochondria. The next slide is a summary. Again, it looks complicated. It's not complicated. Very simple. Again, normal cells. Normal cells, glucose goes in, converted to pyruvate. Pyruvate goes into the mitochondria, converted to acetyl-CoA, required for melatonin synthesis. Melatonin synthesis scavenges radicals. Melatonin does a lot of things in the mitochondria, most of which I have not mentioned, all of which are good. You want melatonin in your mitochondria. Cancer cells, they don't allow this to happen because they inhibit this enzyme. Here's hypoxia. Cancer cells are frequently hypoxic because they're growing very fast. That induces hypoxia-inducible factor and a number of transition factors, all of which activate this enzyme, which inhibits pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. So this cannot occur. So in your cancer cells, no melatonin. Not good, not good. And of course, these are all the other consequences melatonin blocks. What melatonin does is block this enzyme, allow this to occur, so it does produce acetyl-CoA, and then you can have melatonin in your mitochondria. A very simplistic thing, but very important. Mitochondrial source of melatonin to fight cancer is very important. And when you turn on a light at night, even your circulating melatonin levels are low. If I could have that last slide. I think it's the last slide. Oh, no. Melatonin has many, many anti-cancer effects, including on metastasis. We think the primary effect of melatonin inhibits initiation, progression, and metastasis of cancer. But we think the most important thing is it prevents metastasis. What I told you about melatonin not being produced also allows these cells to metastasize much faster. The reason that is important is if you have a cancer, you identify a cancer on your skin, that's not going to kill you. Only when it metastasizes to your lungs, to your brain, to your liver, that's when you die. So the secondary aspects of cancer, the secondary sites of cancer, for example, melanoma, very serious cancer. You can have a melanoma as big as your head. It's not going to kill you. But once it metastasizes, unfortunately it metastasizes very rapidly, but the original melanoma isn't going to hurt you, but it grows somewhere else then it's deadly. So in fact, we think a primary action of melatonin on cancer is in fact prevention of metastasis. It reduces growth factor up there. It has all these effects in terms of cancer. Now, if the next slide illustrates what I hope it does, we'll see. Go one more. Illustrates how melatonin prevents, but yeah. Herein lies the problem, gang. Even if you can maintain darkness every night, you are currently all here. I look around, everybody's in the age of 21 to 25, except me. So when you are young, hopefully you have a very high level of melatonin production, but there's some of you, and it would be nice to know who. It would be nice to know if you're here rather than here, because this rhythm every night is the same amplitude. So if you have a low melatonin rhythm one night, you have a low melatonin rhythm, so far as we can tell, every night. You are genetically deficient. You are hypomelatonemic. We think that has serious implications for how well you age, for how resistant you are to cancer, to neurodegeneration. Now, when you get 50 to 55, melatonin levels are already half reduced. And when you get my age, virtually nothing. How do you overcome that? That's up to you. I have taken melatonin. I have a melatonin rhythm better than anybody in this room, I assure you. Because every night, I take melatonin. I am trying to defer the degenerative signs of aging. There's no guarantees in life, you understand. Even if you take melatonin, you may get cancer, you may get Alzheimer's, you may get everything. Maybe the next time I come in 2 years, I'll be an Alzheimer's patient. But I'm trying. On the basis of what we know that melatonin is very protective against a lot of diseases of aging, not only cancer. So what I do, I have a better melatonin rhythm even though I'm this age. And as long as I live, I will continue to have a better melatonin rhythm because I will always take it. That's not even a recommendation. Your health is your condition, your business. It's not up to me to tell you to take melatonin. All I'm telling you is that melatonin is a very important for anti-cancer, delayed degenerative changes of aging. Alzheimer's models can be delayed. Parkinson's model, Duchenne's. Where's our Duchenne expert? These can be modified by melatonin. And what all these conditions have in common, they have probably they're very complex diseases. Melatonin isn't going to prevent Alzheimer's in every patient. No way. I mean, these are very complex diseases. But I'm doing my best to modify, to delay the progression. Prevention is always better than treatment. Always better than treatment. You don't want to develop Alzheimer's and then have to be treated. If there's any way you can prevent, that should be your choice. That's what I'm trying to do with melatonin. I've studied melatonin before most of you were born. So I have a pretty good working knowledge of what melatonin does and can do. And on the basis of this, and no toxicity, it's endogenously produced, I'm going to have a normal melatonin rhythm as long as I live. Is there one more slide? Maybe. Well, conclusion. I told you, melatonin is older than dirt. You know what dirt is? Sand. It's older than sand. Melatonin is present in every animal and every plant that is currently living or that has ever existed, so far as we know. Obviously, not everyone has been measured, but every species in which melatonin has been assayed, it is present. And it is present, we think, because they have either mitochondria or chloroplasts or both. I told you, plants have, you eat some melatonin every day because it's in the plants that you eat. Melatonin is both taken up and synthesized by mitochondria. So when I take melatonin, it also gets into my mitochondria, and it's produced in my mitochondria when I'm young. So I have to, if I want mitochondria in my, if I want melatonin in my mitochondria when I'm older, like I am, I have to take it because the mitochondria are no longer producing it. So I take it. Only a small percentage of the total mitochondria is from the pineal gland. I showed you that. Every cell in your body is busy producing it. Melatonin reverses the Warburg effect, that's prevention of pyruvate into the mitochondria, which is very good. You do not want the Warburg effect going on. You want to convert those cells to a normal phenotype, and melatonin does this. Melatonin inhibits cancer. We think this is the most important. Melatonin makes this, you develop a cancer. They start treating you with chemotherapy. And a month later, the cancer cells, no, I'm not interested. They begin to grow. They become resistant to chemotherapy. How do you prevent them from becoming resistant? Give them melatonin. In animal studies, animal cancer that are resistant to doxorubicin or tamoxifen that become resistant, if we give them melatonin, these drugs become effective again. Melatonin is endogenously produced and safe. Every drug in existence has what is called a lethal dose, an LD50, a lethal dose for 50% of the animals. Aspirin. Aspirin is a very toxic drug. You can kill yourself with aspirin if you want. You cannot kill yourself with melatonin. You can give grams of melatonin to a little animal, and then he looks at you and says, "Is that the best you got? Come on." Melatonin is uncommonly safe. That doesn't mean in every disease, under every condition, it will always be safe. There's always exceptions to everything. But I'll give you a specific example about aspirin. I'm sure most of you do not know this. In the United States, every year, 700 people die of aspirin toxicity because of gastric hemorrhage. Throughout the world, it's estimated that 10,000 people die of aspirin, including Brazil. Some Brazilians are dying of aspirin. If one person would die of melatonin, I'm sure it'd be taken off the market. But you kill 10,000 people with aspirin, who cares? Just 10,000 people, no big deal. It's a big deal. Melatonin will not do that. I don't mean to obviously I emphasize melatonin very strongly, but you have to make the decision if you want to ever consider the use of melatonin or what you're going to do with the information I gave you. I gave you the information for your benefit. I do not make any recommendations. You do what you want to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Russ, for your brilliant presentation. We always learn from that. Now we will open for questions. If anyone has questions, please tell us.
You're all happy with your melatonin, huh?
If there's anyone who takes melatonin and want to share us your experience, please feel free to share us.
If you want to ask in Portuguese, he can translate. Portuguese or English?
It's better in English.
Thank you very much. My name is Stephanie, and I am very curious about this, and especially about plants. Yeah, how it's measured the melatonin in plants.
Yeah. The question relates to melatonin and pain. She asked, what's the measurement? What effect does pain have on melatonin levels? That aspect has not been done. In other words, remember what I told you is what's important is your nighttime levels of melatonin, and very few people are willing to do experiments at night because they have to stay up at night. And if they do, they're in the light and they inhibit their own melatonin. But melatonin has been used to treat pain. But pain is a very heterogeneous thing. There are many, many types of pain and intensity, but the evidence is that in some cases, for example, fibromyalgia, and I know I forgot who I talked to about that already, there's some evidence that the pain of fibromyalgia is relieved by melatonin. And let me put it this way, there are certain pain clinics in the United States that routinely use melatonin in conjunction with other treatments to treat pain. I think melatonin has some benefits in terms of treating pain, but it's not very clear under what circumstances it should be done.
Any more questions?
Thank you, Professor Hurst. Your lecture was amazing. I think I'm curious about everyone here wants to know what about the safe doses of melatonin that we can take, what the brand you can take, because certainly will make this the use of it better attractive.
The dose. You would like to know if you have a weak melatonin rhythm. You'd like to know that first. If you are deficient, as indicated by you. But most people don't have that option because you don't go to your doctor at 2 o'clock in the morning. And not only that, you have to draw the blood sample at hourly intervals to see when the peak occurs. So how much should you take? If you're going to take it, if. I'm not telling you to take it, but if you're going to take it, how much? And when should you start? At what age? We discuss this all the time. I told you by the time you're 50, your melatonin levels are half of what they are now in you young people. So we think around the age of 45, 40, 45, maybe we should begin to supplement with melatonin. And again, remind you, the purpose is to prevent or delay diseases. You do not want to get disease and have to take expensive treatment. You want to prevent. So, 45, 40, how much? Hard to tell. Most preparations are 3 milligrams. 3 milligrams is nothing. We have diabetics who take a gram, 1,000 milligrams every day. I personally take 100 milligrams every day. But I'm very old, you understand. I think if you're going to start, you should start 45, 50, 3 milligrams, and gradually increase it as you grow older. There's no studies that proving that is effective because no long-term studies have been done in humans. We don't give melatonin to a 45-year-old and study them until they're 85. It just takes too long. In animals, we can do it, and they do better if you give them melatonin. I'm an animal, so I take melatonin. And if you were going to take it, I would start at, I'd say 45 every night before bedtime. And as you age, 6, 9, 15, 50, The other question was, what product?
Yes, what product? And
That's also a very good question, because there are many, many melatonin products available. And you don't always know where they were produced. Tajikistan, you don't know. And you don't know the purity. Purity is generally not a problem, but I can give you an example where it became a big problem. Tryptophan, about 40 years ago, was taken as a sleep aid. And all of a sudden, 38 people died, and they blamed tryptophan. It wasn't tryptophan at all. It was a compound called compound E, and the disease they got was eosinophilia myalgia syndrome, and they died. So everybody blamed tryptophan, but it wasn't the tryptophan. It was a contaminant in. And maybe some melatonin products are not as pure as they should be, because they're not well controlled. So what we have done is we have taken from the market tablets from different sources and measured the melatonin. If it says 3 milligrams, do they have 3 milligrams? And how pure is it? Well, we've only measured 5 different ones. Source Naturals, which you can buy online, is a very good product in our estimation. Natrol is the one I use. Do you have Costco? The Costco company here in San Paulo? Costco, and the other thing about these products are both very safe, and Nature Made, that was one of the other ones we measured. But I take Natrol, and for example, if you take, and they sell 5 milligram tablets. If you, has anybody ever accomplished this twice? Nobody. But if you take 5 milligrams, 250 5 milligram tablets in America costs $12. That's almost enough for an entire year. $12. How can you go wrong? How can you go wrong? Why not take the chance and say, yeah, I think I'll take some of that stuff.
And Professor, as it is a sleep aid, for example, if yes, you take it a lot of years already, and you feel any difference when you don't take it? You can sleep normally, or
when you don't take it? Well, you understand that melatonin is not what is called a soporific. Some of the prescription drugs actually force an abnormal type of sleep. Those are called soporifics. Melatonin does not force you to go to sleep. The melatonin effect on sleep is a circadian rhythm effect. The way the sleep biologists describe it, when you take melatonin, it allows you, opens the normal sleep gate, allows you to sleep normally, not artificially like the soporifics do. But what this means is you have to take melatonin at the correct circadian time. And melatonin for sleep is only effective, even the people who sell melatonin say it's only effective in about 65 to 70% of the cases, because some people are taking it at the wrong time. Most people take it 20 minutes before bedtime, but maybe some of these individuals should take it 2 hours before. We don't know how long it takes to open that sleep gate. So, it's not a soporific, it's not universally effective, but some people that I've recommended melatonin for sleep come back and they say, I have never slept in my life until I had melatonin. It can be a very effective sleep aid, but it's not universally for everyone. I mean, melatonin is universally for everyone, but it may not necessarily make you sleep better. I often take melatonin before I go to bed. At my age, you often have to get up in the middle of the night. First of all, if you get up in the night, do not turn on a light, ever. If you have to use the facilities and you can't find your way, use a corner of the room. But even then, sometimes when I come back to bed, I have melatonin tablets on my bedside. I'll take a couple more, even in the middle of the night. I'll take another 10 milligrams. Not a recommendation. Your health is your condition. True? Say yes. True. Yes. Say yes, sir.
Sir.
We have another question from this side.
Professor Reiter, thank you for your amazing lecture. We were live on YouTube and we received an online question. Rodrigo asked if continuous intake of melatonin supplement could permanently inhibit our own production on pineal gland.
Very, very important question. I'm often asked that. Endocrinologists say, for example, if you take estrogen, you will inhibit hypothalamic releasing hormones to release gonadotrophin. There's a feedback. Hormones have a feedback effect. First of all, I want to mention that although melatonin is typically called a hormone, we never call it a hormone. It's not a hormone. It has very specific antioxidant actions and many other actions. So it's not a hormone, but you didn't say it was. I'm just saying it isn't. But if you take melatonin, you do not interfere with your ability to produce it. In other words, if I take melatonin at night, I can measure my melatonin peak on top of what I take every night. It has no feedback effect. That has been demonstrated many times. And the reason it doesn't is because melatonin is regulated differently. In the hypothalamus and the pituitary, it works via feedback mechanisms and it's hormonal. The pineal gland, remember, produces melatonin in response to a chemical signal. Norepinephrine is released onto the pineal sites and produces melatonin. This is not affected by melatonin itself. So you will not interfere with your own melatonin if you take it. The other thing I want to say is there's no physiological or psychological dependence on melatonin. In other words, it's not like heroin. If you take heroin, in 2 weeks you're addicted. You cannot be addicted to melatonin. You take melatonin for 5 years, quit, say, yeah, no problem. No problem at all. So melatonin has really a lot of advantages. But it's not perfect. Don't leave here and say, Reiter says it's a miracle. No. Just a good, wholesome molecule that I'm not going to be without in my lifetime. There was
Any more
some
questions?
up there.
Thank you, Professor. I have 2 questions. First, there is association between melatonin and the flourishment of plants, because we know that there's plants that flourishes depends of the darkness time. So there is association because we, in botanic studies, we study more the phytochromes.
Absolutely, that's also very important. Obviously, there are certain plants where you can induce them to flower by giving a short burst of light at night, or they only bloom at night. And some of them only bloom once a year for 2 hours in the middle of the night, one night a year. Does that have anything to do with melatonin? We do not know. We do not know. There's not been a lot of studies on melatonin and flowering. But I think what florists could do and other people could do, when you cut plants, flowers, and put them in a vase, if you would add melatonin to the vase, I think the flowers would maintain a healthy condition significantly longer, which would be a very big advantage if you were doing it and your neighbor wasn't. You say, see, my flowers are good after a week and yours are dead within 3 days. We haven't done that because we are not plant biologists, but there are a lot of things, melatonin in plants, that are very, very, very good for plants. I'll give you a specific example because it applies to Brazil. Brazil raises a lot of soybeans for export, especially to China. But what we did about 6 years ago with Chinese scientists, Professor Wei at Beijing, is we incubated soybeans that we were going to grow into plants in melatonin solution overnight. So they absorb more melatonin. When we planted those, they sprouted earlier, They grew larger, but most importantly, when they harvested, there was a 10% increase in soybean production because the seeds were incubated in melatonin. Now think about this. There are 375,000 tons of soybeans grown every year. If you increase that by 10%, you have 37 tons of soybeans, which is very, very significant. In other words, we think we could improve production. That's been done with cucumbers and corn also. It's not unique to soybeans. You understand the land mass is limited. We have to figure out ways to increase production without using more land. And I think melatonin is one of the ways we may be able to do that. Because we've done it with soybeans, corn and cucumber. We haven't done the corn and cucumber, we did the soybean. And now we are doing an outside study with larger numbers of plants and so forth.
Thanks.
But everything suggests if you take any seed and incubate it overnight in melatonin, the plants grow better.
Oh, great. And the second question is, the people that makes more exercise, a long-term exercise, can produce more melatonin because they have higher mitochondrial amount in their cells, muscle cells.
There used to be an expression about exercise, and maybe it was common here too, no pain, no gain. In other words, you should exercise. Not good. You create more free radicals when exercise is great, but it should be done uniformly in moderation to improve your mitochondrial function and the number of mitochondria. When it gets to this point that it's painful, like we said, if exercise is painful, it's not doing you any good. It's doing you more harm than good because you're creating a lot of free radicals. The other thing about exercise, you understand, you don't want to use too much oxygen. Remember I said you need it to survive, but it also kills you because it's the source of free radicals. So very strenuous exercise is not necessarily good. Exercise is good, but not very strenuous long-term exercise. And the exercise people in the United States have finally caught on to that. They used to say, no pain, no gain. Now they say, no, exercise.
Any more?
Well, thanks, Professor. Thanks for the lecture. And I was wondering if melatonin contained in plant material could have a significant effect on our body and our physiology when we take it as food or as infusions in the case of teas, and if there's and if it is not a species, a plant species that has a significant production of melatonin, then we can use it as a source of melatonin.
It would be nice to have knockouts for melatonin synthesis. There's a knockdown, but there's no knockouts. In other words, if you have never had melatonin, how well would you live throughout your life? We don't know that. We simply do not know. And your other question is, are there species that do not have melatonin?
Actually, my question was if the melatonin contained in plant material could have an effect on our physiology, and if there's a plant species that has a noted concentration or production of melatonin that we could use for supplementation or...
The question is, you eat some melatonin every day.
Yeah.
How important is that for you? Again, we don't know. The amount of melatonin you eat is very small compared to the amount you produce. Are there certain plants you could eat that have a lot of melatonin? Generally, nuts and seeds have higher levels of melatonin. And the reason for that is very obvious. Nuts and seeds have a lot of lipid, fat. Fat is very easily oxidized. Remember, The seed is like the female oocyte. If you damage that seed, that plant will not grow. If you damage her oocyte, she will not become pregnant. So the seed, these seeds and nuts have higher levels of melatonin. The nut with the highest levels of melatonin that has been measured is the pistachio. You know pistachio? And that's interesting because the pistachio plant can grow in the harshest environments. It can grow in cold, it can grow in hot, it can grow in dry. It doesn't need water for 3 years, and yet it flourishes. Does that relate to melatonin? We don't know. But seeds usually have higher levels of melatonin. And the green parts of plants, as opposed to the roots, have higher levels because they are photosynthetic. Photosynthetic produces free radicals. If you have free radicals, you need melatonin. There are no chloroplasts in the roots. So.
Well, unfortunately, pistachio seeds are really expensive around here. I don't know in the United States.
Thank you. I'm not getting tired. I hope you guys aren't either.
Hello.
Hello.
So,
Hola.
I have a lot of questions, but I will try to reduce them. The first, if I understand correctly, we need the blue light to inhibit the production of melatonin. Okay. So, if we are blind, we have some trouble about the melatonin, the production or the control?
Blindness is an interesting thing. You can be visually blind and still see light and darkness. In other words, if you have your eyeballs, you can be, I can't see you, you can't see me, but you can see light and darkness, and those blind people have a normal melatonin rhythm. But if you have retinoblastoma and the eyes are actually removed, then the melatonin rhythm, I told you the clock does not run at 24 hours, it runs at 25 hours. And every day the rhythm shifts a little bit, so sometimes during the day, these blind people who cannot see light have high melatonin during the day, and that makes it very difficult for them because they're sleepy, they are out of synchrony with their environment. The syndrome is called non-24 because you no longer have a circadian cycle of 24 hours, it's 25 hours, and that creates problems. And it's being advertised in the United States as a syndrome, non-24. So blindness is relative. That brings up another very important point. There are maybe parents in this room that have children. If you have children, and if you allow them to sleep with the lights on, I'm going to recommend to the police that you put in jail. You should never allow the children, sometimes I'm afraid of the darkness, and they allow the children to sleep with the lights on. Never. That's when their circadian rhythm is developing. You deprive them of and that brings up the idea of night lights. A lot of children's rooms have night lights. They should be red or yellow, have low intensity, not white. White contains blue wavelengths, and that will impede their ability to produce melatonin. So there's a lot of implications of light that we've overlooked. When Thomas Edison invented light, artificial light, what he said was really phenomenal. He said, the best thing about light, it has no physiological effects. Whoa, was that a misstatement? I'm going to talk in Sao Paulo about the negative effects of light at night in terms of cancer, in terms of neurodegenerative diseases. We have taken light for granted. We think this is normal. Not normal. Sunlight doesn't compare to these lights.
How about, we know that blinded people have a pre-circadian rhythm cycle, but there's a difference. There's a difference between total blind and partial non-conscious light blinded people.
Yeah.
and seems to be a difference in terms of protection of development of disease.
Yeah.
And totally blind seems to
Yeah.
be protective from development.
There,
You could discuss a little bit.
there were
on this.
publications years ago saying blind people had less cancer. Epidemiology studies, I'm not being critical of epidemiology studies, but they're very hard to quantify and determine. But there is some evidence that blind people who never suppress their melatonin may in fact have less cancer, may in fact age a little bit slower, but I don't want to give up my sight for that reason. But I don't know how valid those findings are. Recently, I haven't seen any publications in that area, but there are publications years ago making those claims. In fact, I was a co-author of one of them in 1993.
Thank you.
Okay, I have another.
Oh.
Including the evolution, wouldn't it be better if we produce more melatonin in the sunlight because we are active during the day, so we produce our
Yeah.
mitochondria is working a lot. So wouldn't it be better? I don't know.
Very clever question. We should be producing melatonin during the day, she says, because that's when we are producing more free radicals, because that's when we are using more oxygen, and that's when we are more active. True, but we're only talking about pineal melatonin. Your cells produce melatonin 24 hours a day, whether it's day or night. But it's a very interesting question. I've been asked it many times. We should be producing melatonin during the day, but there's not an animal in the world, whether they're active at night, active during the day, have crepuscular activity, which means active in the evening and early morning. Melatonin is always, regardless of species, produced at night. This tells us something also very interesting, that melatonin does not force you to go to sleep. A lot of animals are active at night when their melatonin levels are highest. It's not a sleep forcer. It can mediate sleep if given at the right circadian time. And there's a lot of examples of melatonin. You're going to think this is crazy. I once said that melatonin does what is necessary at the time. Here's an example. Always high at night. Doesn't make any difference if the animal is active or not. And there's some reproduction. This young lady talked about seasonal reproduction. Some animals breed during the winter months, some breed during the summer months, and both of these species depend on the melatonin rhythm. Totally different in the winter than the summer. Day lengths are different. Melatonin is a very, very, very clever molecule. Very clever. It does what is necessary to improve the circumstances. If you say that to conventional biologists, they say, you're out of your mind. I may be out of my mind. People have accused me of being out of my mind. But I've been around melatonin a very long time. I wouldn't have an adulthood if it wasn't for melatonin. All I've done since I've been 24 years old is melatonin. Who can say that? Who would want to say that?
Just another. If we have depression, if I understand correctly too,
Yes.
we need to use the serotonin, and if you have this.
Melatonin has been widely used to treat bipolar, unipolar, schizophrenia. Most of these diseases are diseases of circadian rhythm. Depression, in many cases, is a consequence of perturbed circadian rhythms. And melatonin does not cure these diseases. It may benefit them in terms of synchronizers or circadian cycle, but I don't think, melatonin sometimes is mentioned as an antidepressant. I don't think per se it's an antidepressant. I think what melatonin does is synchronize your circadian rhythm. Remember, every one of your cells has a lot of genes for circadian rhythms, and they all have to be synchronized for you to feel normal. And depression may be a consequence of desynchrony of all the circadian rhythm. If you give them a signal like melatonin, a regular signal, they may synchronize and relieve the depression. Obviously, there's a lot of research by psychiatrists on use of melatonin for depression. And there's a lot of seemingly benefits. But there are people who do not respond at all. And I think it's, again, not because melatonin is an antidepressant. Melatonin regulates circadian rhythms. That relieves depression.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Gosh, I'm happy. I'm very, very happy.
Excited.
I would like to know if in the pineal gland we produce serotonin to regulates our circadian rhythm, because
In Portuguese.
Ok. Eu queria saber se
Would you like to know?
Nossa glândula do pineal, a gente regula a produção de melatonina através da secreção de serotonina. E depois.
He would like to know about the pineal gland regulation from the serotonin synthesis to be converted in melatonin in terms of circadian cycle.
Isso. Deixa eu completar. Porque a gente precisa, no nosso núcleo, de ter a possibilidade de interferir no metabolismo da mitocôndria, certo? E como é a mitocôndria que faz a conversão de serotonina para melatonina, eu fiquei pensando se seria esse o meio de se sincronizar, de você ter maiores levels de produção de melatonina e menores quando está de dia, por exemplo.
If the mitochondria is the main source of melatonin production, if you have the intermediates inside of mitochondria, like serotonin and other substrates, you can control about the different times of day.
If you enhance the amount of serotonin in mitochondria, will you generate more melatonin? That's totally unknown. We do know if you incubate mitochondria with serotonin, they produce melatonin, and if you give them higher concentrations of serotonin, they even produce more melatonin. So there is an association between the serotonin concentration of mitochondria and their ability to produce melatonin. So if there's a way you can increase the amount of serotonin in your mitochondria, you would likely produce more melatonin, although that has never been demonstrated in vivo. In vitro, we can show that to be the case. But in vivo, we presume it's the case. We make a lot of presumptions in science, and that's one that's unproven.
Obrigado. Thank you.
What do I say? Por favor?
One more question. We have online questions. No? Please.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I would like to know if when we take melatonin, does it modulate our circadian rhythm and our metabolism at the same time? How does it work?
Does it modulate our circadian rhythm and what else?
Our metabolism, our organ metabolism. Yeah.
Our own melatonin.
Yeah.
Yes, melatonin surely synchronizes our circadian rhythms. That's the action on sleep. It synchronizes our circadian rhythms so we undergo normal sleep. And that's why I think melatonin is good for depression also, because it synchronizes your circadian. It gives a signal, a uniform signal to all clocks in your body, and there are a lot of them, that this is the time to start or discontinue whatever they're doing. Melatonin cues all those clocks, because the only way, like I say, your muscles in your legs knows if it's night or day, if it reads the melatonin message. So when you take melatonin, you're giving all these clocks a signal. And if you take the melatonin at night, they know that it is in fact nighttime. Now, if you take melatonin, it does not prevent you from producing it in your pineal gland. And so far as we know in your mitochondria, although we don't know much about mitochondrial production when you take melatonin. But pineal melatonin you do not change, for sure.
Thank you.
Any more question? I was wondering, Professor, if you could say about the questions of how could be an alternative for night shift works to keep the synchronize all the circadian rhythms and to keep the melatonin levels in your blood.
How can you control reproduction in the sheep, did you say? Or did I miss? In fact, melatonin is already used to synchronize reproduction in some species. For example, the Angora goat. The Angora goat is a very important animal because the Angora wool is very, very valuable. So in fact, they synchronize with melatonin the reproduction of the Angora goat with melatonin. And there are some other species now. In Spain, they are doing the sheep, treat it with melatonin. And you can manipulate their reproductive status with melatonin. Because that's another thing melatonin does. It gives the animal time of year. Remember, the melatonin signal is both a clock and a calendar because day length changes every year. So it gives calendar information and daily information. Very, very clever. It covers all bases. So there are things we can do with reproduction in animals with melatonin. And I think for infertile couples, the first choice for a remedy should be the use of melatonin. The oocyte is very strongly protected by melatonin. And if it undergoes free radical damage, it may be fertilized, but it won't implant. You'll miscarry. Or you may implant and miscarry later. Fortunately, the body is very clever to reject less than optimal oocytes. It throws them away. Not always, but most of the time. So I think everybody says you shouldn't use melatonin if you want to become pregnant. I think just the opposite. I think absolutely you should. And I could give other examples of why melatonin is good during pregnancy. The attitude is changing. Now I see more and more studies saying, maybe melatonin during pregnancy is not a bad idea. I think it's a great idea.
Perfect, Professor. I would like to thank once more for coming, for your talk, and for your participation here in Botucatu. Thank you very much. Thank you. And now we would give you a simple gift from Brazil. It's like a milk candy from Minas Gerais state. You give you a certification for your presentation. Thanks for coming. You are always welcome. You are always welcome. Let's take a picture of the rest of the people.